going to continue our program, and we're going to have a legislative update on the Inflation Reduction Act. I'd like to call up Noe Garcia. Noe has a distinguished career in public service, started with former Congressman Henry Bonilla, former Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, then Governor George W. Bush, and former President George W. Bush. So, Noe, please come up. And then I'd also like to call up Robert Da Silva and Christopher Gladbach.
So, like Jesse said, my name is Noe Garcia, and I've worked in Washington, D.C., and I actually helped the bank in Washington. I've had a career there that's been around 27 years in Washington, D.C. I live there with my wife and my 2 children in Northern Virginia, and I'm happy to be here to walk through the Inflation Reduction Act, and specifically the energy and the climate impact that the bill has. The experts here with me today are Christopher Gladbach, and Christopher is current counsel with McDermott, Will, and Emery. And his focus is primarily on energy and M&A projects, development, tax equity, and project finance transactions. Chris works with energy clients in structuring complex equity and debt investments and advises both buyers and sellers in the power sector in mergers and acquisitions and joint ventures and in the development of large-scale energy projects. He assists his clients in mitigating and allocating risks associated with these transactions in conjunction with achieving their primary business and financial objectives. So basically, he can help you navigate they can help you navigate through what this bill will do. And they're going to explain a lot of the technical issues and the challenges that are going to face investors. Some of you are in the room here. And Chris lives in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
The next panelist is Robert Da Silva. And I learned today that Robert is from the Frontera. So he grew up on the border between California and Mexico and has an incredible story as well. Robert focuses his practice on complex border and domestic project finance and corporate lending transactions, particularly in energy, infrastructure, hospitality industries. He advises international and domestic financial institutions, project sponsors, and developers, invest funds in multinational corporations on the structuring and negotiating of complex projects and corporate finance and other fundamental corporate events such as purchases, dispositions, recapitalizations, workouts, and restructuring. He also represents multilateral financing institutions, state-controlled development banks, and export credit agencies. So as you can see, we have 2 very highly qualified experts that are going to help you walk through it. Before they do that, I'm just going to give you a top-line overview of the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think we can go to the next slide. You can go to the next one. Thanks. So here's the overview. You can go to the next one as well. This is the timeline. And the reason that the timeline is important is because, as you can see here, there was a lot of discussion over what was going to be included in this bill. Remember, this started out as Build Back Better. And then you had 2 senators in particular on the Democratic side of the aisle, Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin, that held up the negotiations because of concerns that the Build Back Better bill went too far. So essentially, what ended up happening is the House passed their version of the bill, and secret negotiations were going on. No one knew about this. Get pretty good intelligence from my sources in the U.S. Senate because I'm a creature of the Senate and I have a lot of friends in the Senate, and no one knew this was really going on. They knew that there were some discussions, but it caught a lot of us by surprise. I would say even our experts here probably were caught a little.
Unfortunately so. Absolutely.
Right. So it was a mad scramble. And if you look at the timeline, this never happens in Washington. You don't have essentially a situation where they introduce a bill and 14 days later it is on the Senate floor for a vote with a vote-a-rama. And I will tell you, it got very messy and very crazy for 2 weeks of my life, totally wrapped up on this issue. And I'm sure the guys here were trying to figure things out as they were happening in real time.
The craziness continues for us.
Yeah, we're still trying to figure it out.
So needless to say, the Democrats were able to align all their votes, and we're going to take a quick look and see what actually happened. So this was the timeline. And, you know, one thing I will point out, and they're going to talk about more specifics because I think everyone knows there's about $370 billion in this bill. I'll repeat that number again, $370 billion, right? So that is a lot of resources, and a lot of those are going to be directed towards energy and climate issues. So I think you can move to the next slide quickly. Here's some of the provisions, and I'm just going to put these in big buckets, and the guys are going to go into the details. So lower energy costs for Americans was one of the priorities for Democrats. Everybody knew that gas prices were rising, and they wanted to figure out how they could lower energy costs, and this was going to be part of the solution. They wanted to increase American energy security. They want to invest in decarbonizing sectors of the economy. They wanted to focus investments into disadvantaged communities. I would say that the border region qualifies as a disadvantaged community, and support resilient rural communities. Again, border region is also a very rural place in the huge border between the US and Mexico. Let's go to the next slide, and we're going to attack these kind of quickly. Energy types of tax credits. So this is where these guys are going to help you navigate this because it is complex. Anytime you deal with government bureaucracies, especially when the language was written very loosely, the guidelines are going to be very important, and those are generally going to come out of the Department of Treasury on the tax credits. So energy generation, energy efficiency, energy manufacturing, the Superfund issue, carbon sequestration, clean fuels, and clean vehicles. All of those are addressed as type of tax credits. I can answer a couple questions on the clean vehicles for the EV tax credits, but outside of that, these guys are going to be the experts. Next slide, please. Clean climate and energy investments. So we'll go to the next one. This is the direct investments by agency. One thing that you might find surprising is that USDA is at the top of the list in terms of buckets for money. And I think hopefully Chris and Robert will be able to tell us why, why that is. Why does USDA get such a big bucket of money? Followed by the EPA, DOE, and so on. You can see the list, and we could make the presentation available to folks after the event so you can see where specifically all those dollars are broken up into. Okay, we can go to the next one. The IRA fossil fuel provisions. So while this is supposed to be an energy and a clean climate bill, in order to get all the votes necessary, they had to include some fossil fuel provisions, and it was critical to get Manchin's vote on the issue. So while it seems like a very rosy picture, there is still some resources that are going to be allocated to fossil fuels. And here's a quick list of what those are. I know that that is not the focus of the discussion today, but it's something to consider, that while you're making the sausage, in what we call it sausage making, right, to write legislation, it gets very messy. And so that is why there's a fossil fuel provision in this bill. And it was essentially to get votes from Democrats, because this was a reconciliation bill. And under the rules of reconciliation, you don't need 60 votes to move to the floor. You only need 51 votes, or 50 plus 1 is how it usually works. And that is what the bill actually essentially passed by. It passed by all Senate Democrats voting in the affirmative, plus the Vice President of the United States breaking the tie. It fell completely on party lines. With that being said, I think we should change the slides to the new slides, and then we can look ahead to what's coming down the pike. Here's some of the Mansion's priorities for permit reform, and these are just some of the few things that are supposed to be in phase 2 of this bill, because this was just phase 1 on the reconciliation side. And we can get more into the details, but I don't know if you can change the slides, so I can turn the floor over to Chris and Robert. Christopher and Robert.
Well, thanks so much. I guess I'll say something about the Department of Agriculture. We didn't really cover it in our slides, but I think if you think about the way that utilities are structured in the United States, there's integrated utilities that are that have public service commissions that regulate them, and there's an independent power production in certain regions. But on top of that, there's also a whole slew of electric cooperatives, and both on the generation and transmission side and on the distribution side. And in order to do big time transmission, those electric cooperatives have to be part of the conversation, and essentially they need financing. So I can't speak to why the number's so big, but I know why there was a focus at the Department of Agriculture, because that's the Rural Utility Service at the Department of Agriculture is the agency that typically supports that kind of developments from the co-ops. It's going to be very critical to getting, especially if we're getting a renewable energy project build out, critical getting the energy from point A, which oftentimes is in the desert or across the plains to the cities. And so that's going to be critical. So we can get into some of the slides on the tax credits. We're going to go over some of the technical parts of the tax credits, and then we're going to talk about some challenges, because Rob and I we're not actually tax lawyers. We understand the tax provisions, but we are finance lawyers. And so the way we look at this is how do these tax credits impact both project development, which is more what I focus on, and then also project finance, which is more Rob's area, and how should both developers, investors, and lenders, look at this package. If we go to the next slide. So on a headline basis, the Act extended the production tax credit and the investment tax credit and brought those back to 100% levels. They had been reduced year over year, and so now they've been brought back to 2016 levels, which is a significant bump for new projects. And in fact, we're negotiating several deals where the projects were marginal, but now they are enhanced, and it's attracting a lot more interest in those projects and a lot more build out. Through those projects are getting the enhanced ITC and PTC through 2024. After that, the tax credit actually goes to a technology neutral tax credit, which depends on your amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And so we know solar and wind don't produce greenhouse gas. Those tax credits will continue to be available for those projects for another 5 to 6 years. So it's literally a 10-year runway for projects, and a little bit longer because you have to start construction, then you get a little bit extra time to finish construction.
And Chris, do we just the difference between an ITC and a PTC?
Sure. So a PTC, production tax credit, is just what it sounds like. You usually get a 10 years, and it's 2.75 cents a kilowatt hour over a 10-year period. Whereas the ITC is based on 30% of the eligible cost of the facility. And that's usually paid back, after you submit your tax return in the next year or so. So
Like construction costs.
That's
like
right.
The upfront investment.
that's right. So, one of the interesting things about this bill, previously for wind, you would always choose the PTC, and for solar, you'd always choose the ITC. Now solar and wind are both eligible for both. So you have to make a decision. And so part of what you're going to do as a developer, and frankly, an institution financing this, is looking at how efficient your facility is going to be. And with solar becoming more and more efficient every year, we are going to, our view is that we're going to see a lot more production tax credit deals than investment tax credit deals, because solar just gets more and more efficient, and costs come, at least until recently, costs have been coming down for solar in a way that is going to change the investment landscape. Of course, there's new credits. The standalone energy storage credit is an ITC as well. That's huge. It used to be that you had to put energy storage with a solar project and couple it in order to get the full ITC on the storage piece of it. Now you can have just a standalone energy storage project, and it will be able to get the full credit.
And Chris, just for the group's benefit, why is standalone storage and why is the storage component something that's so important in the marketplace?
Right. So we talked about transmission, right? And the need for, cooperation, not only from the integrated utilities and the munis and the co-ops, but there are transmission constraints throughout the country. And standalone storage can act as a way to remedy certain transmission constraints, because if you can store energy in a place where there's a transmission constraint, you may be able to defer a transmission investment, and the storage can act essentially as synthetic transmission, which is really, really cool.
Exactly right. Anybody who's, I'm sure our feisty congressman would note the the intermittency of renewable energy, and so storage is really a critical piece to bridging that the intermittency problem with what the electrical grid systems actually require. And so folks like me and Chris for years in the market and our clients have been advocating for these tax credits for the storage component in and of itself. So that's a really important development, and it's going to be really important along the border where, certainly in the case of solar, you have utility scale, huge, solar projects, but you have a lot of what we call behind the meter solar projects, which are for, large industrial customers and the like. And so storage is a critical component of that. So this increases very significantly the investor base and the financeability of that important segment of driving that market.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were doing very esoteric standalone storage deals, preferred equity. There was a little bit of bank finance, but now, this credit's going to bring it into the mainstream essentially and make it a mature technology. So it's really great. The other great thing is hydrogen. The hydrogen industry in this country is really in its infancy. And we're delighted. I don't think we're going to have time to go into the specific details of the hydrogen credit. I have a slide, and I think the slides will be available. But especially green hydrogen, where you can couple an electrolyzer with a wind farm or with a solar project. Essentially, you are just like storage. You're creating sort of a panacea for the intermittency problem. And so, if you can store energy in the form of hydrogen, it unlocks all sorts of possibilities, and frankly supports what is now a developing industry, an industry that's in infancy, which could really become a very, very large piece of the whole electric sector and the fuel sector as well.
And that unlock that Chris mentions on hydrogen's really, really important too, because of if you think about the border area and you think about, you know, the long-standing industrial development along both sides of the border, the role that hydrogen, you know, can play, and we see it developing on the technical side, is the type of technology that can be very relevant along the border area specifically. So another thing we're very excited about. The way I think of hydrogen today is this is like, you know, battery storage was 7 or 8 years ago.
Right.
And so these credits are gonna move forward sort of the investor base and the development of that technology in a way that I think we both agree are really important and going to advance the technology, and hopefully we'll be financing it, you know, within the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, we're very excited about this. And of course, there's new credits for domestic manufacturing, very important, carbon sequestration, and electric vehicles. So we're excited about all this. Can we go to the next slide? One other interesting thing about this legislation, traditionally to capitalize on these credits, if you were a developer and you had limited tax appetite, which most developers have limited tax appetite, you had to bring in a third-party investor called a tax equity investor, essentially to monetize these credits. With the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a provision for transferability, meaning that you don't have to necessarily set up a complex investment tax equity structure, and you have the ability essentially to sell these credits to a third-party investor on their own, which is going to create a market for these tax credits and reduce complexity and friction. Now, say all that.
Could it ever be that easy,
No,
Chris?
no. You know, I say all that, but look at these limitations. So, you know, you have to, for PTCs, remember, those are based on production, and it's a 10-year period. So that means every year you've got to have a plan for selling those tax credits, unlike the ITC, remember, which is a one-time slug. So that creates a little friction. There's limitations on how you can carry forward and carry back the credit. Depreciation is a huge limitation. One of the main benefits of bringing in a tax equity investor is not only can they monetize the tax credits, they can also monetize depreciation. And with bonus depreciation, you know, that allows expensing on a tax basis of 50 to 100% of the cost, the eligible cost of the facility. So that can be upwards of, you know, 20% of your tax equity investment. So you're losing that by transferring your credit. Now you may be able to use the depreciation yourself, which is a positive, but that is a piece that sort of needs to be thought through. And by the way, you know, we have all these limitations, but we are advising clients right now on different structures to use. And some clients are excited about transferability. Despite these limitations, we do think there's going to be a market. And, you know, other clients say, you know what, I really like to monetize that extra 20% of depreciation. I'm really comfortable with the tax equity structure, depending on the client's sophistication. So I think it's, you know, for many, it's going to be real boom for their projects.
You know, one question I have in relation to the secondary market, right, for those tax credits, especially with a lot of companies facing ESG issues. Do you think that from a timing standpoint, how long will it take for the market to really mature?
Depends on what you mean by mature.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we talk to corporates all the time. And, you know, we've been talking to Fortune 500 companies about becoming tax equity investors for years and years and years. And they're always interested. But beyond sort of the 5 biggest financial institutions, and Google and Facebook and General Electric, we haven't really seen much penetration from the tax equity investment market beyond those institutions, but there's interest. And I think partly when we talk to corporates about it, it's the complexity that really drives them crazy about this. You have to hire 5 consultants and us, and it's a lot. And if you're Coca-Cola, maybe you can do that, but for a number of companies where it's not their core business to invest in energy projects, they want to participate, but they don't want to divert resources from their core business. And so I think, to your point, I think that market, is ripe because there's a whole lot of tax appetite, in that market that's just that's been held back because of fears about complexity.
Exactly. And I just add, I think the expectation, our view is that the transferability provision is going to increase the investor base from what it sort of currently looks like right now. So the current investor base, is really a small subset of massive, institutions that have this huge tax appetite and can monetize these. And Chris is talking about the corporates that we speak to, and it's these are sort of tax-driven monetization plays that are highly structured. They're very complex, and a lot of corporates aren't willing to they don't have the bandwidth. I mean,
No.
It's funny. No, you framed it just right, because you asked, sort of the drivers, the ESG drivers, and a lot of the corporates that we talk to are, up to their noses or ears or whatever the metaphor is in what the ESG framework even looks like, and just what the reporting, requirements are going to look like, because those are evolving so quickly. So I think our view is that, this does, we think, expand sort of the investor base. We're literally right now up to our knees in sort of figuring out what these transactions now are going to look like, and we don't think, because of these limitations, that transferability is going to solve the complexity problem. We still see a role for tax equity in order to sort of fully kind of monetize the tax benefits. The nature of the developers' businesses that are looking to monetize this, and if you think about the angle that a NADBank is coming from, or any financing party, you are looking for what that that debt support, where that's coming from, and what the financeability is going to be. So the complexity is still there, and the documents are, we're sort of feeling our way through. And fortunately or unfortunately, I think we all agree, at least us on the deal side of this, that the tax equity structure is going to probably bleed over into what some of this transferability sort of piece is going to look like.
I agree with that. So there's still a role for us, which is good.
Say the corporate lawyers.
Thank you, Congress. So can we go to the next slide? So as part of your introduction, you talked about benefits for rural communities and disadvantaged communities, and we're honestly still trying to figure that out. The regulations need to provide clarity as to sort of what that means, but right now we are talking to clients about developing projects on former coal sites, or in communities where there's been significant unemployment and significant economic strain over the past several years. And the preliminary guidance that we're seeing looks really good. And what it means is that for the ITC, which is typically 30% of the project costs, you depending on the credit regime and depending on the nature of the community, you could get anywhere from a 10 to 20% bump on top of that. So if it's so you could say if there's a 50% ITC, in the most extreme case, you can imagine that that project is going to attract a lot of investment.
Yeah, I was just going to add, guys, damas y caballeros, like along the border area, I mean, this is going to be a piece that's really critical, I think, for players like NADBank. This is going to be a real value add for the kinds of projects that you can come in and make a difference on. We'll talk a little bit more, and no, you referred to that in your piece as well. That we'll talk a little bit more in more slides about NADBank's role. But this is going to be a really important value add, and I think the folks at NADBank really want to be digesting this piece and analyzing how this fits into their relationships with municipalities, cities, private actors in terms of the projects you're considering.
Right. And I think the next two pieces, the domestic content piece and the wage and hour and apprentice piece, we really are digesting that, and we really need good regulations on that. It's something our tax lawyers are consulting with Treasury on right now, but we know that it goes both ways. So essentially, there's a bonus on the wage and hour and apprenticeship and the domestic content piece. There's also a penalty. That penalty essentially we're trying to figure out, but essentially until the IRS and Treasury publish regulations, there's a little bit of a runway now to continue to develop projects without having clarity on this piece.
And I'd add, in the financing space, this is an area where players like NADBank can actually add on the margins some additional value on the financing space. I could tell you with commercial private banks, they're not going to become sort of experts in this area. We all know how sort of the commercial, international banks kind of approach these things. They really rely on the expertise of their investor clients. In this case, sponsor developers of projects, but we also know that there's really a range of expertise among that class of at sort of that investor segment. And so, my view is, development banks, multilaterals, NADBank specifically, boning up in this area and really understanding it is a way when you team up with private capital on projects that you can add, again, at the margin, some value, because that's going to be risk that commercial banks will be looking left, right, up and down, but not in the mirror. So something to consider.
No, that's a good point. And I think this last piece about direct pay, there was a lot of lobbying to have direct pay for everybody. But I think where we ended up is pretty good. So the direct pay is going to be available for certain tax exempt entities and certain governmental entities, tribes, and the TBA. Again, we're still evaluating, how that's going to impact, specific governmental entities, and frankly, development banks. And so that's something, watch this space. We'll have more to say on it as the regulations, because depending on how it cuts, could be very relevant, especially for this audience. So we'll continue to update.
And that'll be some homework for Noe.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
So next slide, please. Okay, so I talked about hydrogen generally. I think we're running on time, so I'm going to skip this slide. But if there's questions on hydrogen, we'll hopefully we can make the slides available and we can follow up on that. So we talked about all of the good things in the in the Inflation Reduction Act. Thought it was important to actually spend a few minutes on the current challenges that developers and investors are facing in the market. So the way that we view the Inflation Reduction Act essentially is a medium-term to long-term runway for projects that for the brave. In the very short term, there are significant constraints on the development of renewable energy projects that we can't just gloss over. And in fact, I'm putting out an article. I'm a little plug here. I'm putting out an article today that was published in Project Finance International. And if folks are interested, give me your card after. I'll try to get it to you. Basically, the thesis being, given these challenges that we have, and given the long-term rosy picture that there is, how do you bridge the short term to get to the bright future? Okay, and our thesis essentially is that private equity essentially is going to play a bigger role in the short term to try to bridge some of these issues. So the first issue is issues with solar panel supply. You all are likely familiar with the anti-dumping countervailing duties case. The Oxen case was going to potentially, and this is all about China, right? So this is going after panels that are coming from Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, with the theory being that they're essentially being washed, and they're actually Chinese panels that are essentially trying to circumvent the duty regime. This case was thankfully suspended for 2 years by the Biden administration, but for projects that are going to extend longer than 2 years, and their development cycle still represents significant uncertainty as what those tariffs are going to be.
And just to give folks in the room a sense, I mean, when this happened, this is like driving down the freeway at 70 miles an hour and then just throwing the emergency brake on. I mean, every project that we were involved in development, whether it was in late stages and I was doing the financing or early stages development, everything came to a halt industry-wide. It was really dramatic.
Yeah, and so we got relief, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief until they realized the second bullet, which is the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which we as a country have made the important decision that we're not going to support forced labor in China to produce these solar panels. Now, the issue is that Customs and Border has looked at tracing the materials that are made in these solar panels, and in many cases has determined that the suppliers can't prove where they came from, and there's a rebuttable presumption that if you can't make that trace, that they were produced using forced labor. While that is getting worked out, gigawatts are being held by CBP, 5 gigawatts to be precise, and it's estimated to be 12 gigawatts by the end of the annual period, which represents way more than half of the installed solar capacity in the United States. So significant challenge. We don't know what the solution is. We're still working with clients to deal with customs and figure out how we can both get panels in, but support the very positive role that we don't want to be supporting forced labor in this country. So that's those are both important goals that we're working with clients on. All these issues are causing, including the other issues, interconnection issues, interest rates, inflation, are causing power purchase agreements to essentially be underwater. We're renegotiating a number of power purchase agreements. There are many distressed projects out there. So that's the current landscape that we're facing. There's a whole lot of distress in the market. But there's a rosy outlook. So maybe we go to the next slide, and Rob can kind of talk about what we're seeing from a financeability standpoint.
I'm the rosy outlook guy.
Right.
Well, listen, I think we'll keep this. I know we only have a few more minutes, and you know, we'll talk about this. But what I want to do is kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about some of the implications of the IRA and specifically what's going on in projects, as well as, people say this all the time, but would be interested if anybody has thoughts, to chime in these last few minutes, incluso en español, no nos importa, está bien. But at the macro level, I mean, what Chris said in the beginning is, when we got the opportunity to come and talk to you guys about what we're seeing in the market, Chris and I, our impression and sort of our whole team, we have a big energy transactions, tax, regulations team. When the IRA, surprise, was passed, it was a big sigh of relief because the market actually, when you zoom in right now in the near term, is actually significantly distressed. And it has to do with inflationary pressures, supply chain challenges, these, China specific, considerations and concerns, this kind of clash of, policy goals that we have. And so that's why from a sort of a mid-term to long-term perspective, the IRA we view as very important. We think that, given sort of the current challenges in the market, at the margin, we already see the contours for enough sort of marginal additional economic value to kind of overcome these near-term hurdles and keep a lot of these projects going. I think it's fair to say that 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago, Chris, on the developer side of what you were doing,
Yes.
the kinds of notices that were being sent out on existing projects, I think the outlook at the investor class level was very, very different than it is fast forward 8 weeks now.
Absolutely. I just got a call yesterday, and client said, there are 20 projects we were looking at that were underwater, and now they're all going to make money for us. So, it's amazing.
So big picture, this was really important. Everybody knows, the congressman, I'm sure, would have thoughts about sort of, the economic, position that we find ourselves in. It's not just the U.S. It's, this inflation, inflationary period is an international, reality. But what this does is, one of the second point in here is, it just continues the capital inflow into, I call it renewables, but really we should be thinking about this as sort of cleaner energy, increased liquidity in our worlds. Listen, I'm just the finance nerd, right? So I represent either the multilateral bank or commercial bank or the developer that's borrowing money. But what you need is a really, deep liquid investor class. You need, banks around the world to be investing at the corporate level and at the portfolio level, not just at the individual project by project level. You need that too. But the NADBanks of the world also need their opportunity sets, right? And so you need that deep liquidity in order to be able to provide value, to municipalities, to states, to, regional actors, in their plays, which is why, that bullet there on, sort of the capital markets and kind of what I call, development chains. The last bullet there, I think, restates what we already know, but the IRA does do a lot to better align sort of our longstanding policy goals, putting aside sort of the unfortunate sort of hyperpartisan reality that we live in today, going to Noy's point about how the IRA was passed on the vote basis. But couple of components that Chris had mentioned, the technology neutrality of the tax credits is a really important change. You know, it used to be, you know, technology would advance and develop, and then, you know, whether, you know, every year it was like there was a new lobbying effort to extend tax credits for another year or 2 years, or, you know, open up a new, you know, technology to being able to receive credits. So that's a big improvement. And then something that matters a lot in my world is the technology to financeability pathway, because NADBank understands. I mean, you know, you guys will take maybe a little bit more risk than some commercial banks when it comes to sort of, you know, nascent technologies or the way in which it's deployed or the region in which it's deployed. But that matters a lot. You know, Chris is talking about hydrogen, and we have been talking about energy storage. This is a way to really move that path along and accelerate it. We think that that's very important. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I'm getting the the hook. Well, in any event, we talked about transferability and direct pay. They're not a panacea. They're important topics, so we're happy to talk about that more. And you know, you guys, the pricing pressure on banks is a little bit less relevant to the NADBanks of the world. Your commercial bank partners, this is a big challenge for them. And I think our view is that, you know, in the near to midterm, you know, the IRA is just one more thing that's going to keep this space very competitive, which is good and bad. And then we could talk about other stuff sidebar afterwards.
Right.
Thank you, guys. This was incredibly insightful, and thanks for your time up here. I feel like I'm smarter now after this panel discussion.
A round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you so
Appreciate it.
much.